that time, of course, that which has been yielded by Senator Isaacson. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I spoke 4 times on the Senate floor in the last month on the tragic civil war that unfolded in Cote d'Ivoire, and which ended with a full-scale attack upon the city of Abidjan by the rebel forces of Alassane Ouattara, the United Nations, and the French military. At the end of that military operation, President Gbagbo and his wife Simone were captured by the French military forces, acting as rebel forces loyal to Ouattara. Now, while I was thankful that both the President and the First Lady were taken alive, both were mutilated and brutalized, and I condemned the use of so-called peacekeeping forces made up of the United Nations and the French forces which attacked the city of Abidjan and the presidential palace. That it is these forces that have caused countless deaths. I happen to know, I'm very familiar with that area. I've been there many times. I've been to Cote d'Ivoire, to Abidjan specifically, almost 15 times, maybe 15 times. That area right there is an area that was detonated. There are small, I have no idea of knowing how many in that particular picture of people, citizens of Abidjan, were burned to death. And I have to say that it's not a role of the United Nations, and I question why the French participated in this battle. The African Union, a supporter of ousting President Gbagbo, has since come out and condemned what it called foreign military intervention. In addition, President Museveni of Uganda has said on April 11th, one day prior to the capture of the Gbagbos, and I'm going to read this. It's a quote now from President Museveni. I have not been happy with the way the United Nations and the international community, especially the French, have responded to the events of the post-election Ivory Coast. I'm not pleased with the way the international community can sanction a situation of bloodbath in the domestic affairs of African countries. I would prefer a peaceful intervention by an African Union committee that would investigate into the matter, give the parties a fair hearing, and come out with a workable recommendation that can promote peace and stability in the region. Other Africans, Mr. Chairman, the current African Union Chairman, Obiang, also condemned this military intervention in Cote d'Ivoire by saying, quote, Africa does not need any external influence. Africa must manage its own affairs. Kenyan President Odinga was also quoted as saying that President Gbagbo, quote, has been captured, and I say that he should not be hurt. I have actually already sent word to Mr. Ouattara saying that Gbagbo should not be hurt. If he wants to go out into exile, he should be allowed to go into exile, but he needs to be treated humanely. Remember the word exile, because we're going to come back to that. And former South African President Mbeki has written an eloquent condemnation of the United Nations and the French-led civil war in the April 29th edition of Foreign Policy magazine. I strongly recommend that the members get this, and I'll make sure they have copies of this. Mr. Chairman, I had warned the State Department and the United Nations and the French on the Senate floor in 4 separate times last month that they would have blood on their hands if they continued supporting the rebel forces of Ouattara and continued the bombing the financial capital of Cote d'Ivoire, Abidjan, and did not agree to an immediate ceasefire. I said on April 4th that, quote, I think we can avert a real tragedy, something maybe comparable to what happened in the 1994 Rwanda genocide. I called for a ceasefire, and no one responded. Next day, April 5th, I said on the Senate floor that Ouattara has tried to deny his involvement in the slaughter of up to 1,000 innocent civilians in the western town of Cote. His forces took out the town earlier last week. Now, this was on April 5th that I made this statement, after the Gbagbo forces had gone. The Gbagbo forces weren't there. What you're looking at here, these are hundreds, and I can't tell you, quantify them, somewhere up to 1,000 people in the town of Cote that were murdered by the Ouattara forces. Look at them down to the far left. The other pictures were actually in other communities around there. I can't really identify that, but they're in that vicinity. Those pictures down there were the ones that Ouattara's forces came in and brutally murdered. I called again for a ceasefire and with no response, and that was on April the 7th. On April 7th and 8th, I pointed out that the UN and French were bombing downtown Abidjan near the presidential palace, where hundreds of young supporters of President Gbagbo had encircled the presidential palace in a human shield for the bombing. Who knows how many of them were killed? This is what they did. These were young kids, baseball bats, boards that were up there. There they are. That's all of these young kids. You can't see how young they are. You can if you look up close. I invite you to come up and look. But all of these are different places. That happens to be a garage. You can see that they're working on there. And these are the kids that are crying and are you can tell they've been abused. We don't know how many of them were killed during this process. Mr. Chairman, I pointed out in April 8th that there were roving Ouattara death squads who were quoted disappearing, they used that word instead of killing, disappearing supporters of President Gbagbo, meaning killing him. I called again for immediate ceasefire. No one responded. That is and you can tell by what they're wearing, those are the Ouattara death squad, those are the individuals, and be no doubt about that. So, Mr. Chairman, I also pointed out that I believe a massive voter fraud occurred in November 28th in 2010 in Cote d'Ivoire presidential election between President Laurent Gbagbo and the rebel leader Ouattara. I submitted evidence in 2 letters to the State Department that showed massive voter fraud and to steal the election. In one instant, it showed that the first round of the presidential election, and this is very significant, not quite yet, the first round was they had in what we would call the primary election, the President Gbagbo, got thousands and thousands of votes in the northern areas, the Muslim areas, the areas which were Ouattara's areas. And yet when they had the next election, we would call that here in the United States a runoff, he got 0. That is a statistical impossibility. Everybody here knows it. In another case, the voter tabulation return sheet for one of the 5 regions in the rebel-held north showed that Ouattara received an extra 94,000 votes made up out of thin air. We don't know where they came, just in the tabulation. Now you can see very clearly, that's the official tabulation. If you look at the results on this the side over here, the total of that would be 149,000 votes. However, they recorded, as you can see, 244,000 votes, an additional 94,000 votes. Now, if you do your math and you figure out how many of these areas there are up there, clearly, if this type of abuse went on in the rest of them, it was Gbagbo who won the election. The Department of State responded to this allegation on April 8th by claiming that this document appeared to be fraudulent without offering any proof. And I'm going to ask these government witnesses today, and they know I'm going to ask because I already sent a letter and telling them I was going to ask, on the record, what, if any, investigation into the authenticity of this document was undertaken. I will also ask them on the record if that document is fraudulent. So, Mr. Chairman, despite my warnings, all of that I predicted and warned against came to a pass. An orgy of bloodletting occurred during the Ouattara offensive, which was joined by the United Nations and the French. They have left behind villages and streets filled with the stench of rotting bodies. And there you can see it right there. That is in Abidjan. The bottom left, you can see that they are burning the bodies down there. You can see that what the stench is. We have witnesses that said that there were hogs eating the remains of the charred bodies that were lying in the street. Down there, the next one to the right, in the lower right, he's about to be executed. You can see the gun is to his head. And the top one, that happens to be the Interior Minister of President Gbagbo. He was shot in the face, just enough to leave him alive and let him die a very slow death. That's a picture right up there in the top right.
Senator
Interior Minister. I call again for an independent investigation into all atrocities committed by all military forces involved in the fighting in Cote d'Ivoire, and I call for the United Nations and the French and the Ouattaran forces to halt the immediate death squad still roving. It's happening right now around the streets in Abidjan, killing people out in the streets. You know, I have several friends who are hiding. I've had personal conversations. You can't use their names because they're killing all of them that they can find, where they witness the deaths taking place out in the street, and they can't even go out there because they know that they would be considered to be a Gbagbo supporter, and
Senator,
they too would be.
Please conclude in one more minute, if you would.
Well, I will conclude. Yeah, this is the last page. So lastly, I'll ask the witnesses if they have any information about the whereabouts and conditions of both President and Simone Gbagbo. Ouattara has decades-long political and now militant foes of the Gbagbos. I've read the books about it. We all know it goes back to the 1990s, and I fear that great harm will come to the Gbagbos now if they remain in separate secret locations under this control. I would like to know what our State Department is doing to ensure their safety, and I renew my demand for that the United States step in and examine the possibility of seeking a place of exile for the Gbagbos. I've already located one place in one of the major countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They're willing to take them into exile. This is going to be my plea when I talk to the witnesses. Thank you for your tolerance, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Senator. I'd like to now turn it over to our witnesses. Our first panel starting with Deputy Assistant Secretary Bill Fitzgerald.